Live.
All right, Daf Yomi for the week. We got a bonus day in this week, being a Friday morning special edition, and it is sponsored by Mrs. Sylvie Wald and Jeffrey and Chava Bela Wald, the Eloi Nishmas, just father Avram ben Shmuel and grandfather Menachem Mendel ben Mordechai, whose yortzeits were on the 1st of Nisan. If you're looking for your sponsorship opportunities, get them in now, because the opportunities for getting your portion of Olam Haba, if they don't come back. So definitely jump on that that bandwagon there. We are in the we're going to go back a little bit just to be able to continue, get a rolling start. We're going to be on the second wide line, Tanu Rabbanan. Our rabbis learned Daled Dvar Nemru Be'edim Zomim. There were 4 things that we said about Edim Zomimin, where we have unusual exceptions to the rule of getting the punishment that they scheme to do. Ein Na'asin ben Grusha u ben Chalutza. First of all, the one we said that witnesses cannot be themselves made into a halal. They cannot be considered to be the child of a kohen who marries a divorced woman or a woman who's had chalitza. Ve'in golin lari miklat. Also, they cannot become exiled to the city of refuge. Ve'in mishalmin esa kofer. We're not going to pay kofer. Now, we were rushed through that yesterday, but now we can explain. Really, kofer is the payment that one makes when one's animal kills another person. Right? So if one has an ox, it's a tam. You're not chayav for full payments. But if the ox becomes a muad, it has gored 3 times, and now your muad animal gores and kills a person. So then the Torah tells us that really the Torah sort of makes it seem as though the person who owns the ox is kind of responsible and should get the death penalty for it. But the way that we learned it is that the ox dies instead of the person, and then the person who's the owner has to pay the damages. So the ox dies, and then the owner pays the damages. That's the rule of kofer. Okay, and so the Edom Zomimim, if they testify that this person's ox killed another person, they themselves don't pay that damage payment. Okay, and then we'll explain why today. Ve'nim kard be'eved ivri. Also, they cannot be sold as a Hebrew servant. We'll explain why that is as well, under what circumstance the person would get sold into slavery, and why a Zomim wouldn't be. Rabbi Akiva, Mishum Rabbi Akiva Amru, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, they said, Af ein mishamin al pi atzman. They also can't pay for their own admission in court. If they come and admit that they are Edom Zomim in court, they're also not going to be liable to pay. And we're going to discuss what circumstances that falls under.
They're not liable to pay.
That's correct, if they come and admit it. So we're going to understand what circumstances that falls into. So we have 4 plus Rabbi Akiva, and we've already explained 2 of them. Ein na'asin ben grusha ben chalutza keda amran. We already explained the first one because it's in our Mishnah, that they cannot be a ben grusha or ben chalutza. We already said so, because you can't do it to him, you can't do it to his children. You have to punish him, not his children. And if we punish him and not his children, then it's not the same punishment as what he wanted to give to the other person. So you're caught in a catch-22. You can't satisfy both parts of the pasuk. Vasisim kasher zamam, vasisim lo kasher zamam. You can't do to him, literally to him only, but what he wanted to scheme. Those are 2 things that wind up being in conflict with each other. You can't do it. Therefore, you get the 40 lashes. Vein golin lari miklat. You also don't send this person to a city of refuge, because Kidamran, like we said, that it was a Reish Lakish told us it was the pasuk, Hu yanus el echas ha'arim. He goes to exile. Only the person who commits negligent murder goes to the city of refuge. Not, should say negligent homicide, right? Only goes to the Ir Miklat, not anybody under other circumstances. Okay, so now we're up to the next one, the 3rd one. Vein mishalmin es kofer. And that's where we left off yesterday. We don't have to pay. We don't pay the kofer penalty, this penalty for my ox goring and killing another person. Kasavri kufra kapara. So that's because we are under the presumption, there was an argument in Bava Kama when this first came up, whether the payment was, in fact, a atonement penalty, meaning that the owner of the ox really should get killed because he really is responsible for the death of this other person. But because it was his property that committed the damage, the Torah says that he can escape death by redeeming himself from punishment. He can get an atonement by paying money. Versus the other way of looking at it is that kofra is mammon, is it's a financial penalty. You caused a financial damage, therefore you have to pay a financial penalty. We are going to say that there's no reason why if it was a financial penalty, why the Edom Zomim wouldn't pay it. They're liable to pay for other financial testimonies. If they testified, for example, that somebody owed $1,000, they'd have to pay that. Then why would this be any different? The answer is because this is not a financial penalty. This must be going according to the opinion that holds that this is an atonement penalty. V'hani lav b'nei kapara ninhu. And these witnesses are not subject to the atonement. Now, this is actually interesting. I'm not quite sure whether I just read it properly. The witness, I always read it that way, that the witnesses are not subject to atonement. In other words, that the person if my ox damages, the reason I'm liable to pay is because I'm redeeming myself.
Right.
But now these witnesses, they have no redemption, they're not redeeming themselves from anything because they didn't do anything. Why would they be liable to pay? I'm not quite sure whether that reading, if that's my understanding from other Rishonim, whether that's how to read that line, because never is it true about witnesses, the scheming witnesses, are they really liable to pay because they didn't do the thing that they're Adam Zoman, by definition, didn't do the thing that they're accusing the other person of. They're paying as a punishment because they did it. So the potential understanding of this is, and you're going to tell me that you already read the other Rishonim, and so you already know this thing.
Right? Rashi sounds like that. It's like they're not considered needing a kapara for what they didn't kill the shark.
Oh, exactly. So therefore, what Rashi didn't realize until I read it through this time, that really what it is the person who was accused by these Adam Zoman, would never pay the damage that he's being accused of paying. Why? Because the Gemara in Maseches Bava Kama talks about if this is a kapara, what happens if the person who owes the money, if his ox does the goring, doesn't feel like paying? Let's say he decides, I don't want to pay.
Right.
So can we force him to pay? Well, if it's a monetary payment, of course you can force somebody to pay money that they owe, but you can't force somebody to get a kapara. So if he refuses to pay, maybe we don't make him pay. Well, what would happen in this circumstance now? This person gets dragged into court by these false witnesses. They tell them that his ox gored and killed the person, right? And he says, no, it never happened. Well, they say, okay, you're liable because, well, would he pay? Of course not. He knows it never happened. So even though the court might tell him you're liable, this person would never have paid. Hence, if the person would never have paid, how can you say that these scheming witnesses should pay if they then cause a damage that the person would never have paid?
Right. I always thought it was to replace what the Sharmoid had gored. That's what I thought the kapara was.
That would be
that's what I thought the.
So we're going to hang on to the next little bit of the Gemara, right? The next little section of the Gemara is going to discuss that issue exactly. Mm-hmm. However, so what we're saying is that since no ox, in real life, these are scheming witnesses. Nobody got killed. No ox ever did it. And therefore, no payment would have ever been made by anyone, regardless of the fact that these witnesses schemed this. So therefore, how can you then turn around to the scheming witnesses and hold them responsible? This is an unusual type of payment. So that's why these scheming witnesses don't pay it. Because the person who they testify about wouldn't have paid it either. Okay? So therefore, now we get into Brian's question. I always thought Brian says that kofar is a repayment, a monetary payment. You're paying for that which you cause damage. So we're going to get into this issue. Man tana kufra kapara. Back in Bava Kama, who is this opinion that says that this kofar payment for this animal that does the goring is a payment of atonement rather than a financial payment?
If it's payment atonement, why would the payment go to the person who got? Where would the payment go? I would think it would go to base medrash or something like that. The courts, not to the person.
So the question is, when you're the atonement, in order to get an atonement, it just needs to leave you, right? The question is, where should it go next? Right. So if I'm atoning, I got to pay.
Right.
Doesn't really matter where it goes after that, is what your point is. Because I atoned. I got rid of them. I lost the money. That's my atonement. It only makes sense that the place where it should go is maybe where a loss is felt, regardless of whether that's an atonement penalty, right? Why would a base medrash get let's make a donation to Kahal Yereim as because my ox killed.
Who are you asking atonement from? The atonement.
That's a great question. Who are you asking atonement from? Who?
Hashem.
Really? Hashem's the one that got damaged?
Hashem
or the family?
Damage. But when I make atonement, I make atonement to Hashem.
Right, but the atonement, when you damage another person, you're asking for atonement from the person that you caused damage from.
Okay.
So maybe that's the atonement.
That's, I think, it's like a mazik and like when you're a damager, you pay what you damage.
Correct. So
that's
this
why
is sort of
this is
sort of an interesting thing because it's an atonement that's a damage. You really are asking for atonement from the family who's of the person who got killed. Maybe that's why the money goes there.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so who's the person who holds that this is an atonement? Amar Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. The time we're in a brisa. V'nason pidyo nafsho, that the Torah only says that he has to pay the redemption of his soul. That's the way the Torah phrases it. Whose soul? Well, there's two people involved: person who's done the damage, or the person who's been damaged. Debay nizik. That's the Tanna Kama says. The responsibility is to pay the value of the person who was damaged, who received the damage. And Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka Omer Demei Mazik, whereas Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, says the value of your own soul, the value of the person who did the sin. So my lav behakamifagi. This is the point of their argument. Demar savar kufra mamona. If you hold that the value of the payment is the value of the person who received the damage, then it's a financial payment. You're paying the damage. Umar savar kupra kapar. But if you're paying the value for yourself, why would you pay the value of yourself? The answer is because I'm redeeming myself from sin. Therefore, I am receiving atonement. So if you hold it's an atonement penalty, that's why you would pay the value of yourself, not the value of the damage you caused.
Right, okay, that makes sense.
Good?
Yeah, no, because when you talk about mazik and nizik, you always talk about the value of what they damage. In this case, it doesn't specify what you're paying for. So therefore, it's open to.
So Amar Rav Papa. So Rav Papa says, "Lo, not true. That argument is not relevant to this discussion." Dekule alma kufra kapara. Everyone agrees in that argument that kofar is an atonement penalty, is an atonement payment. This is all their argument is about. Mar savar ben nizik shaminan, mar savar ben demazik shaminan. The only argument is how do you evaluate the value of an atonement penalty? Right? In other words, we presumed that the source of the value of the atonement penalty indicated whether it was an atonement or a monetary payment. Not so. The atonement could be an atonement penalty regardless of how you're evaluating it. My taimayu de rabbanon. What is the reason why the rabbis say that you're going to evaluate it according to the damage? Nemar hashta hashasalamata v'nemar hashasalamala. The answer is because if you look in the psukim, the psukim have a comparison, have a payment amount, a payment requirement in the part that deals with this payment and the part of the section previous. And umalaholan beninizik, the section following. Malaholan beninizik, just like in the section following, is a discussion about payments, refers to the payment of the person who gets damaged. Afkan beninizik, so too, this valuation of the kapara penalty is going to be the value of what you damaged. And Rabbi Yishmael, nasan pidyo nafshoksiv, Rabbi Yishmael says, no, just read the pasuk by itself. Don't get tied up with what comes around it, which is talking about other types of damages. This pasuk itself says that you're redeeming your soul, and therefore you're redeeming your own soul. Therefore, it's your own value. And yeah,
I just one question. Every other case of mazik and nizik, an Adam Zomin would have to.
That's right.
Pay. So in this case, they don't have to pay. So then we know it's not for sure.
Well, according to this,
right.
As we said, that's because this follows the opinion that it's kofar kapara. If kofar would be money,
right,
then they would disagree and say the Adam Zom would have to pay. That's right. That's exactly the point. Yes. Rabbanan said, you're right. I agree with you. Read the pasuk. Pidyon nafshoksiv. It says you're redeeming your own soul. Mihu miki shaminan beninizik shaminan. It's just that when you redeem your own soul, what is the value of the money that you have to pay to redeem your own soul? The answer is it's what financial damage you caused to the other person. Okay, so that is the dispute. Okay, great. So we understand that one. Kufra kapara. Next one that Adam Zomer are exempt from is veinim karbet evet ivri, that they cannot sell these Adam Zomim as an evet ivri. So Savar Rav Hamnuna Lamemer Rav Hamnuna thought to say Hanimi lihecha de islay lididei. So what's happening is like this: in order to become an evet ivri, you have to have two things happen. A person has to steal money from another person, and then when he gets caught, he has to be so poor that he cannot repay what he stole. Therefore, he gets 6 years of service, and each year of service is valued at 1/6 of the amount that he stole. Right? That's the case of it every. He steals $6, right? So he goes to service. Each year of his service is valued at $1, such that if he paid $3, he'd be redeemed from 3 years of service, and he'd only have to work 3 more years. If he steals $600, he goes to 6 years of service, but the value of redeeming himself per year is $100 per year, and he pays $300 to get 3 years of service off. That's how that's going to work. Now, let's say these Edom Zomim were rich guys. They knew that they wanted to get this fellow in trouble. He's a poor person. So they testify that he stole $100 knowing he cannot pay it back. And therefore, he's going to get sold into slavery. But they have $100. So therefore, what's going to happen? You can't do kasher zamam because they say, well, if we were in fact the ones who stole, we would have just paid off the debt and not gone to slavery.
If the slave master find out that they're lying, then what?
That they were lying about how much money they have? Yeah, that's it.
How much the poor man stole?
So that's what's happening, right? So they're going to find out that these witnesses are liars. And so therefore, we're going to say, well, if these people have enough money themselves to pay off what they claimed, so then for sure they don't go into slavery. Why should they go into slavery? Because the punishment that they schemed to do to the other person was to sell him into slavery under the condition that they didn't have enough money to pay. And he has enough money, and these guys had enough money to pay.
So make them pay it. So make them pay.
So make them pay.
Right.
Make them pay, but they wouldn't get sold to slavery.
Right. No, but I'm saying
all it says is they don't get paid. Oh, they're going to get lashes. We're going to say that they're right because why? Because you can't. We're going to say you can't make them pay either because then they can say, well, we never intended to make him pay. We intended the slavery, but you can't sell us into slavery. So you can't give us the payment. You can't make us go to slavery. Therefore, you got to give them lashes. Okay, demigo deihu lo mizdavin, because since these witnesses would not have been sold, inunami lo mizdavnu, right? So he says, so therefore you can't sell them. Okay, but what would happen if this fellow? What did I say? Right? Sorry. Let's start again. Hamnuna says, this is talking about where the person, I read it wrong, but the person who they're accusing has money. Right? The guy has thousands of dollars. He has money. Okay? So therefore, they don't have that kind of money. Demigo deihu lo nizdavin. They could say, look, we never intended to get that guy sold. He had plenty of money to pay off the debt. We just wanted him to lose a little money. Right? So therefore, migo is since. Right? Since this fellow, since he wouldn't have gotten sold, inunami lo mizdavin. You can't sell us, because that's not what we scheme to do. But let's say the person who they were accusing didn't have the money. Afagav deislahu ladidhu mizdavnu. We would say, well, then even though these witnesses, they have plenty of money, they should get sold, because what did they scheme to do? They schemed to get him sold. So they should get sold. But then the witnesses should say back to him, I'ant hava loch mi hava mizdavenes. So he says, but if you would have had the money, you wouldn't have gotten sold. So now, ananami lo mizdavni, you can't sell us now, because we do have the money. Ella, Savar Rav Hamnuna Lememar, therefore Rav Hamnuna thought to say, Hani mili hecha isle oladide oladidhu. So he says, you're right, that's a fair point. So that means that if the person who is being accused has money, you can't sell these witnesses into slavery. If the witnesses themselves have money, you can't sell them into slavery. What if neither of them have the money? Okay? Then, Aval hecha deleisle loladide v'loladidhu, I would have thought that if he has no money and the witnesses have no money, mizdavni, then you could sell them. That's fair. It's exactly the same punishment and the exact same result. So Amar le Rava, so Rava says, v'nimkar b'geneva, so no, there's a reason why you can't. Even though they're Edom Zomim, even that works out, doesn't work because the pasuk says that only a person who steals, gets sold into slavery. Amar Rachmana b'geneva so v'lo b'zamamo. It is a xeris akasav again. The pasuk is telling us, just like we had by the case of sending somebody to the city of refuge, only a person who steals gets sold into slavery, not a person who's an Eid Zomim. Therefore, by exclusion, you cannot send a person who's an Eid Zomim in just because the pasuk says so, even if the circumstances are identical.
I have such problems with this. I'll tell you why. Kasher zamam las sois, right? So what if he doesn't have? What does it matter about the actual situation? It's what you accused him of doing. Therefore, you're supposed to do. That's the pretty much the lashon. That's the lashon of the Gemara.
You have two problems here, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is that the pasuk says that what you scheme and what actually happens have to be the same. That's the problem here. The scheme was sell this guy if he cannot pay, and now we wind up in a situation that I cannot do that to the witnesses in the same way. If the witnesses and the person who's being accused are not in the same financial situation, I cannot actually put these witnesses into the same place that this person was in.
So-
So finances make it impossible to do it.
So, example of what I mean. Reuben accuses Shimon of stabbing someone to death.
Yes.
And you find out the guy has no arms or no working arms.
Okay.
Does he get 40 lashes? Because he can't do it, because that's not a realistic situation.
Because it's not a matter of, it's the question is, can you apply the punishment to him? And you can apply the punishment. Here you cannot apply the punishment. Not you can't apply the crime. Right? Okay, so now, Mishum Rabbi Akiva Amru. Rabbi Akiva has this extra one that Edom Zomim cannot do, and they says that you cannot admit your testimony in court. You cannot admit that you were Edom Zomim and get off the hook, right? Not pay. So pay. You would admit it. You would not pay. My time at Rabbi Akiva. Why does Rabbi Akiva hold that way? Kasavar knasahu. Rabbi Akiva holds that payment of Edom Zomim is a knas. How do we know? We're going to see. How do you know it's a knas? But we had two types of payment. We had financial payments and we had penalty payments.
Knas is more.
It's a penalty payment, right? Knas is the penalty payment. So knas ein mishalem al pi atzmo. And a penalty payment you never pay if you admit and testify in court. You walk into court and say, I am liable for this fine. The court says, thank you very much for admitting it, and let you off the hook. You don't have to pay it. Okay? That's the way that works. Amar Rabba. Rabba says, Teda, you should know. How do I know whether Edom Zomim is a knas or it's not? And by the way, it's going to be an argument on Daf Daled. So we'll hang on to that. But, Hare lo asu ma'aseh v'neheragim. Look, these Edom Zomim, they didn't do any action, and they can even get killed, right? In other words, they didn't do anything. What's the purpose of the punishment? The punishment is literally a punishment. It's a knas. It's a fine on what they did. U'mishalmin, and they pay. So therefore, if you cause damage and you have to fill in the hole that you created, that's a monetary payment. If you didn't do anything at the end of the day and you're paying, that's a fine. That's different. Rav Nachman says, Teda, and I'll tell you how you know it's a fine. Sharei mamon biyad ba'alim u'mishalmin, because the owners, the person who's being accused, still have their money, right? And these scheming witnesses have to pay. Well, now we're on Daf Gimel and Aleph. So my nihu delo asumaisa. So he says, why? So what is that? What is Rav Nachman saying? Rav Nachman saying that no action actually took place, right? No payment ever took place, and nevertheless the witnesses have to pay. Well, Haidu Derabba, that's the exact same thing, right? We just basically said the same thing twice, didn't we? Rav Nachman said, because the money is still there, and we said, how do you know it's a knas? Because you're paying what you didn't cause damage. That's the exact same thing. So, Ema v'chein Rav Nachman. So you're right. So, but Rav Nachman was saying his statement in support of Rabba's statement. Rabba said it, and then Rav Nachman says, yeah, and you're right, because the money is still there. So Rav Nachman is just supporting it. So it's not a contradiction at all. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda Rav. Eid zomim mishalim lefi chelko. Rabbi Yehuda makes a statement, and he says, and he's an Amora, so he's a Gemara era statement. So we're going to try to figure out what he's adding to the conversation that didn't exist in our Mishnah up until this point. He says that an Eid zomim pays his portion, his share. So my mishalim lefi chelko. What does he mean when he means that the scheming witness pays his share? Ilema d'hai mishalim palga v'hai mishalim palga. So maybe what he means is that if two witnesses come to court and testify that this fellow owes $200 and they're found to be scheming, each one pays $100, right? Each witness pays $100. If that's the case, Tanina, we already learned that in a brisa, and an Amora wouldn't come along and tell us something. Rather, he would have quoted a brisa, said, here's what the brisa says. He wouldn't have said it. Why would he say it? Says, here's the brisa, mishalshem b'mamon vein mishalshem b'makos. But when we divide up, when we pay, when the scheming witnesses are caught, they divide up any financial payments they have, right? But they don't divide up any corporal punishments that are capital punishments. They each get the full lashes, right? They don't say, hey, we were testifying 40 lashes about him, each one gets 20. That's not how that works. Only when it comes to money, they share the payment. Ella kegon deitzum chad minayhu. Rather, here's what happens. The two witnesses testify, one of them is found to be a scheming witness, the other one never gets caught. So that means that the one who got caught has to pay his half. Well, the Mishalim Palgas, he's going to pay half. The Palgadide, he's going to pay his half. But that's not true. Factually, halachically, that's not accurate. Umi Mishalim, would he have to pay? Vatanya, we learn in a brisa very clearly. Ein eid zomim Mishalim mamon ad shiazumu shneim. Eidim zomimim, and Rabbi Akiva is going to say if there's more witnesses and more, it's going to be no payment. There's going to be no payment until until all of them are found to be scheming witnesses. So therefore, if one is a scheming witness and the other one is not a scheming witness, so we're not going to pay. So that's not true. So that's not what it means either. Amar Rava, so Rava says, Be'omer edus sheker he'adi. What happens is the two witnesses were scheming witnesses, and one witness says, I admit it, I lied. Okay, so one witness gets caught, and the other witness testifies about himself. I lied. So now, when he testifies about himself, Rabbi Akiva says, when he admits it, he doesn't have to pay his $100. He doesn't have to pay his half. Well, problem with that is kol kamine. There's a problem with that admissibility in court of that testimony because kevan shehigid shuv edom chozer umagid. We have a principle that says when a person comes to court and testifies and his testimony is completed, he cannot go back and amend his testimony. His testimony is considered submitted and he cannot amend it. So how would this work? Person testifies and says, we saw you give $200, we saw you borrow $200 from so-and-so, you owe him the money. And then they're about to pronounce the case. He goes, you know what? I'd like to announce I lied. Well, you can't. Sorry, thank you very much for wanting to announce that, but this is a court and you cannot change your testimony, right? Why do we do that? Because we protect the initial testimony. We're concerned that somebody came over later and said to him, you better not be testifying or else you're in trouble. We protect the original testimony and we prevent him from changing it.
Except for murder. We said for murderers, people are allowed to come back and retract their...
They can't retract their testimony. They can argue the case. They can argue rational and reasons and why, but they can't but they can't change their testimony. Even the witnesses, we said, can come and give reasons why what they saw wasn't what they saw or whatever, but they cannot change their testimony. Right, that's a good point. So rather what happens is that they come into one court and they got caught. Well, they don't want to pay, so they ran away to another place. Well, now this guy feels guilty, and he walks into Beis Din in the new place that he's at, and he says, we were witnesses in another place, me and this other guy, we were witnesses, and we got found guilty, so I owe $100. That where Rabbi Akiva says, if you came in and you admitted that, you don't have to pay it. Okay? Keman, so who is that? So according to this is Delo Rabbi Akiva. This is not like Rabbi Akiva. This statement that if he comes into another Beis Din and he admits it, then he's got to pay for himself. This is what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, that he has to pay. This is against Rabbi Akiva's view. Dik Rabbi Akiva, Hamar Af Eno Mishalim Al Piatzmo. Rabbi Akiva holds that you don't pay of your own accord, right? And here's Rabbi Yehuda saying that you do. Ella, so rather, what's Rabbi Yehuda's point? That's the statement, and that's why we brought this whole conversation. That was the place where Rabbi Akiva says that if you come into court and you admit yourself that you owe the knas, you don't have to pay it. So rather, here's the circumstance that Rabbi Yehuda is talking about. Omer, he'adnu v'hozamnu b'beis din ploni, v'chuyavnu mamon. What happens is like this. We were liable, we were found liable, the court pronounced our case, we were Edom Zomim, they pronounced the case. And then the Beis Din went one step further and said, and now you're liable for this payment. You change, the Beis Din at that point changes the knas into a financial obligation by making that statement, saying you now owe $100, case closed. It went from owing $100 because of being a fine to being owing $100 because the court ordered you to pay $100. A court order of $100 is a financial obligation like any other financial obligation. Therefore, he has to pay it. Salka daita chamina. So I might have thought that his testimony about himself is really dependent on it being true about the other guy also, right? Because he's got to come into court and say, I testified falsely with the other fellow. And one guy can't testify about the other fellow, right? He's one witness. Mm-hmm. So ihu nami lo mechayev, you couldn't believe him as well. Kamash malon, therefore this is coming to us to tell us that you can testify about yourself, about your financial obligation, even if your testimony is dependent on something being true about another person. We disregard what you said about the other person, but we are going to believe what you said about yourself, because you could be believed about yourself like 100 witnesses, and you are believed to admit it yourself. It's not considered a knas admission anymore, because the Beis Din already pronounced you liable to pay the money. So now it's just a financial, you're just coming in to admit that you're paying a court-ordered payment, and you have to pay it. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. And Rabbi Akiva's point about the knas was, if you were found liable in court for being an Eid Zomim, and then, before Beis Din pronounced the amount you have to pay, you left, you could then run into the next Beis Din and say, I was an Eid Zomim, and I admit the $100 that I owe, and you'd be off the hook at that point. Right? Those are two different distinct stages.
It's interesting because it's two different courts,
Yes,
right?
that's
In
what's
Canada,
critical.
that wouldn't work because you owe the court.
Because the court is the state, right?
Right.
The court represents the state, whereas every Beis Din operates as an independent entity in the Jewish law, right? So that is important to note too. Next Mishnah. This is what Ellie was looking forward to, right? Here we go. Me'idin anu es ish ploni, right? So let's say another circumstance of Edom Zomim. They testify about a person, shegiresh es ishto, that he divorced his wife. He's saying, I did not divorce my wife. I know what you're talking about. He says, you divorced your wife, velo nasun la ksuba sa, and you never paid her ksuba. Okay, now ksuba, we should point out, has several parts to it, just to be able to know all the parts, right? A ksuba, we said, has a 200 zuz automatic, right? 200 zuz gets put into the ksuba that the husband pays his wife on the circumstance that they get divorced or he dies. Okay, so then that's 200 zuz. Then he can add in whatever other money he wants. That's additional payments. Okay, then we have what's called tzon barzel. Tzon barzel is literally the iron sheep, not the iron sheik. That's a whole different thing. That's an 80s reference. This is the
Old
iron.
wrestling reference.
That's very good. Old wrestling reference. Iron sheep. The iron sheep is that the wife has property in her possession when she gets married. Okay, and what she wants to do is she wants to protect this property. So she writes in. She says, "This is the dowry, and here's what's going to happen." It goes into the ksuba. The husband, you have the right to use this property during the marriage, okay, and use it up and whatever you want. But if we ever get divorced, you have to pay the original value of what these sheep were worth when we get divorced. Okay, that's when they're called tzon barzel, because they never depreciate in value, they never appreciate in value, they stay the same value. So if the husband takes these sheep and he slaughters them, and then they sell the money and buy a restaurant, and then the restaurant does well, and then they buy this and they buy that, at the end, she doesn't get the proceeds of the restaurant or whatever, she gets the value of the original sheep. That's it. So that's the tzon barzel. Then we have what's called nichse malug. Nichse malug are property that she owns at the beginning of the marriage, which she says, essentially, I am keeping these properties. These are going to be belonging to me all during the marriage. The husband has the right not to use the actual item itself, but to use the peiros, the fruits, the whatever proceeds come from it. However, she gets that actual item back if they ever get divorced. They own a tree. And so he's allowed to eat the pears that grow from the tree, but the tree is hers. Now the tree is not nearly as valuable after 7 years of marriage than it was at the beginning, and so therefore, when she gets divorced, she gets the tree back because that's nichse malug. It's the actual tree. Tzon barzel, he'd have to pay the original value of what the tree was worth when they got married. Nichse malug, she just gets it back as it is, right? If it's a dead tree, she gets back wood at the end of the marriage. Okay, so that is how nichse malug works. Those are all the payments of the ksuba. Now, when somebody testifies that there's a divorce and he owes chayav the ksuba, so we're going to look at this ksuba and see that there's a payment of the 200 zuz, extra payment, and tzon barzel, and that is the amount that the husband has to pay to this wife and their divorce. So now that's really what these two witnesses are claiming. You're going to be responsible to pay. Now, problem is saying that you owe, let's say this ksuba is valued at $1,000, right? The problem is that you're not really obligating him to pay $1,000 because okay, he might not be divorced now, but he might eventually owe her the ksuba. After 120, he should pass away, and he's going to owe her the ksuba at that point. So therefore, you can't claim that you made him pay a ksuba that he wasn't going to pay his wife anyway. So therefore, how are we going to evaluate what really was the damage caused by this early payment? Omdin, we're going to evaluate kama adam rotzilitain biksuba sel zu. We're going to evaluate how much would a person want to pay for this ksuba. She'imnis almana onis garsha ve'im mesa yirshena bala. There's two sides to this ksuba. There's two potential outcomes. There's a gamble here. If he dies first or they get divorced, she's going to collect the money. If she dies first, he gets to keep the money. Also, he gets to use the money in the ksuba the entire time that they're still married. So there's two values of this ksuba. The ksuba can be valued at her payment, and that's what seems to be the Mishnah saying. The Mishnah is saying that we evaluate how much is this ksuba worth if she went to the marketplace to sell it. So there's got to be some futures market guy who's thinking to himself, well, there's $1,000 ksuba here, but their marriage is pretty happy and he's not that healthy. He's got some heart disease. You know what? I'm willing to pay $400 for that ksuba because I'm pretty sure 5 years from now, this guy's going to have a heart attack. And if I buy this ksuba, I'll get the $1,000. Now I got to go through the hassle of going to court and being able to collect it. So all that factors in. So, okay, so that's my price. So there's a price that this is worth. It's a futures market gamble that she goes to the market to sell her ksuba. That's how much he's losing. The way the Mishnah seems to sound is that's how much he's losing today because that's the value of the ksuba today.
But why don't they just go by, if she got divorced today, this is what he would have. Why don't they just go by the value of what's written in
Because let's say then there was, you say it's $1,000. Okay, great. Next day he comes in and he goes, you know what? I do want to divorce you. And now he's going to pay $1,000 anyway. The witnesses didn't really cause him $1,000 loss because he's going to have to pay it anyway at some point.
Right, but at that moment.
But that's not the way that you can determine something's value, right? The value is how much loss did you cause this husband? You didn't cause the husband $1,000 loss if he's got to pay it anyway.
But that's not what it says about kasher zayman. It says that basically like mida keneged mida.
That's right. The actual loss that you cause a person.
Not that the actual loss you could have potentially caused a person.
No, that's not what it says.
When you accuse someone of murder.
No, don't keep
Right.
going back to murder because this is a financial case, right? This is a financial case, and we're dealing with what is the value of this ksuba today. You're telling me that the value of the ksuba is its full face value. That is not true, right? Because that's like saying that I've got a stock option or something that I've got, and then my stock is worth 5,000, and then the bank says to me, well, you know what, we're looking at this, and you're going to say, well, the full value of the stock is 5,000. Well, no, because my cost basis is the amount I bought it for minus the amount that I'm going to sell it for. Well, you're only causing me the loss of what I would have sold the stock for today versus what I would have sold the stock for tomorrow. My loss, if you tell me that you sold the stock today, right? Let's say I've got a stock, right? Stock is, I've got this Tesla stock and it's very low right now. And so somebody testifies, you sold the stock. Okay, great, but I didn't really sell the stock. But then meanwhile, he wants to hold it because he wants to sell it next week. How much loss did you cause him? You caused him the loss of the entire Tesla stock? No, you caused him the loss of how much he would have made had he waited from selling it today to selling it next week. Right? The only real loss is taking away my ability to buy it or sell it now. Okay? So that's the circumstance. Now, the Gemara wants to know, though, Ketzad Summon, how are we going to evaluate this ksuba? Because the way that the Mishnah seems to imply that you're evaluating what it's worth to this woman if she sells it in the open market is problematic. Because the scheming witnesses didn't scheme against her, they schemed against the husband and claimed that he was divorced. So to say what her market value is in this contract does not make sense. Right? Who cares what she could have sold it for? You caused him the loss. Right. So rather, Amar Rav Chisda explains, Biba'al, that what you have to do is that you are looking at the husband's value of his side. Right? Remember, there's two sides to this contract. The husband can go to the open market and sell his side. His side is actually more valuable than her side. Why? Because as long as this marriage goes on, he's entitled to keep using all of the property of the Nichsei Ditzon Barzel that she brought into marriage. He could still use it. So therefore, the husband side actually has more value because there's real property that you're getting right now. And then there's a chance you may even be able to keep it. And there's no legal fees because I'm in possession of everything. So if there ever comes a question, I'm the one in possession. So therefore, the husband's side is actually more valuable. It's still not worth $1,000 because there is the chance that the husband will eventually die, and then the wife is going to come along and say, "Fine, I want to collect that property," and he'll lose the entire property. So you can't say it's the real actual value of the property, but there is a value that the husband can sell this for.
These Adam Zomnani must be working with the wife.
No,
Well,
they just might be friends with her.
Friends with her.
Wherever they want, they're right. They might be trying to help her out. Maybe, or they just don't like the husband.
Yes, but she has to agree to this.
But they're not. But no, because they're not claiming. She's going to benefit, right?
Yes, she's going to benefit.
She's going to get the money, right? They might just not. They either whatever their motivation is, right? Either they don't like the husband, or they like the wife. Whatever is the reason, right?
I struggle with. I struggle. It's like if I was selling my business, I'm a partner in a business because that's basically what this marriage is, right? And
right there, I'm going to stop because here's the reason why. Here's the reason why you cannot compare. I'm selling my business or I'm selling my anything.
Right.
Right. You are, as we're going to see in the next Mishnah, selling something, being told to sell something now that you are going to sell anyway next year.
Okay.
That's the difference. Your business, you're saying, I own my business. I don't have to sell. I can keep it forever. It's mine.
Right.
So now when you tell me that I sold my business, I lost my business, you owe me the value of my business. Let's say you had an agreement that you are going to rent, that you are leasing your house.
Right.
Okay. So now I live in this house. Okay. Great. So then somebody says, it's not your house. I have proof it's not your house. I'll throw you out. Okay.
Right.
Are you telling me that now I have to pay you the entire value of what the whole house really is worth? Of course not. You were going to leave in a year anyway. Your lease is up in a year. I only have to pay you the value of the lease. That's
Right.
what it caused you to loss.
Right.
Because I'm going to leave the house anyway at some future point.
This is his portfolio, basically. When you're selling the ketubah, it's literally his portfolio.
Which he's going to have to pay at some point. Which is not like your portfolio. Your portfolio is yours for good. The ksuba is not yours for good. The ksuba is eventually going to get paid.
Right.
That's the difference. Right?
I hear it. Yeah, fine. I hear that.
Right? You cannot compare ksuba to any other possession that you own because at some point there's a call option here. Right? Somebody's coming to get it.
Well, why can't you just take away like what is owed, subtract what would be owed?
Says Rav Nassan Baroshia. Thank you. Now you're going back on track. Rav Oshia says, Be'isha, we're going to evaluate the woman's value. What you do is you take the $1,000 of the contract, right? And then you're going to subtract how much the woman, her value of the contract is, right? Why? Because the husband would have freely bought that. Because if she's going to offer it, if she goes on the open market and says, I'm selling my ksuba for $400, that's a deal he's going to take. Why? Because now he becomes the full owner of this portfolio, never has to pay it under any circumstance. He's the best buyer. He loves this deal because he takes no risk. Right? So therefore, he's essentially buying $1,000 worth of stuff for $400. Right? So he loves this deal. So therefore, he'd gladly pay that. She's not offering it to him, right? But he'd gladly pay it. So therefore, the value to him is really the full value of the ksuba minus what he would gladly pay her for her part.
Right.
So that's the way we do it. And then comes Rav Papa. Rav Papa, Be'isha u'biksuba sa. He says, Rav Papa says, yeah, but there's one last little piece that you have to remember. I agree with what Rav Nosson is saying, but you have to remember there was something called the nichse melug as well. There's the nichse melug part, and the nichse melug part, you have to do some kind of evaluation in there of how much the value of the fruits were that the husband was going to be able to use as well. So you got to value that into the case too. Right? Remember that he's losing, if he's going to sell the ksuba immediately right now, he's losing the right to continue to use the fruits from her nichse melug property too. So you have to evaluate that in and consider that and subtract that from the value as well. So those are the different ways to be able to evaluate this. Okay, next Mishnah. Says the next Mishnah, moves a little quicker. Somebody says, and this is going to be another one of these circumstances. We're not going to ever go into a very straight case where somebody says $1,000. We already know those answers, right? This is somebody says, you know what? You are obligated to pay your friend $1,000, right? And your payment is due in 30 days. Okay? The person says, he says, no, I agree. There's $1,000 loan here, but I had 10 years to pay it off. So now what's the value? You can't say it's $1,000 because I agree I have to pay $1,000. I just think I have more time.
Right.
So Omdim, we're going to make an evaluation. Kama Adam wrote to litain v'yu biyado elef zuz bein nosnon mikanvad lamed yom bein nosnon mikanvad eser shanim. How much would a person pay, even though such a thing would actually be ribis, it would be illegal to pay for this, but how much would a person be willing to pay and have a loan due in 10 years versus 30 days? Right? People are willing to pay different interest rates or different amounts for a lengthier loan versus a shorter term loan, right? So therefore, since I'd pay more to be able to hold on to this loan longer, I'd pay more interest on the loan. So therefore, that's how you evaluate it. Now the Gemara wants to talk about some technical point here. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says, Shmuel, Hamava chaver le'eser shanim. Let's say I loan somebody for 10 years. We have a problem, and that's called Shemitah. Shemitah year comes every 7 years, and it cancels debts. So how can you have a 10-year loan in the first place? Okay, so Shvius Misham Taso. Shemitah is going to cancel this loan. We're on Daf Gimel on the base now. Even though in the 7th year, you're not up to the 10th year of the loan yet, and the loan is not due, nevertheless, you might think, well, it's not due, therefore the loan's not canceled. Sof asila de lo yigos. In the end, it's going to be due, and therefore, Shemitah cancels that loan. Okay, so now Meisiv Rav Kahana asks a question on that statement. If what Rav Yehuda, who's an Amora, is saying is true, that Shemitah cancels 10-year loans, so then how do you explain this? Omdim, we learn in our Mishnah. Omdim kamadam rotzilitain v'hu elef zuz biyado bein litain mikan vad lamed yom bein litain mikan vad eser shanim. How do you understand our Mishnah? Our Mishnah has a case where there's a 10-year loan, and we want to be able to evaluate how much a person would pay to have a 10-year loan versus a 30-day loan. Via March Shvius Misham Taso. So if you're going to tell me Shemitah is going to cancel it, Kulu Nami Boishlim, you should pay the full $1,000. Why? Because a 10-year loan is equal to 0. Because I would never have to pay it. So the answer is Amarava. So Rava says, I'll give you examples. The Mishnah, there are circumstances, even though Shemitah is going to cancel a loan, there are circumstances where Shemitah would not cancel a loan. For example, B'milval Mashkon. Let's say I borrow the $1,000, but then I give you something worth my watch to hold on to instead. Well, now it's not quite a loan because you're not coming to get the $1,000 back as much as I'm coming to get my watch back, and we're trading back. Therefore, since that's the exchange, Shemitah does not cancel that kind of an arrangement. Also, what if I take my contracts and I give them to the court and I say, as an individual, Shemitah cancels my loans, but courts do not have their loans canceled. So I give it to you. Rashi calls this a prusbul. Tosfos says that's not a prusbul. A prusbul is where I write a contract and a document and I write to the Beis Din and I say to Beis Din, you're going to collect my loans for me. That's a prusbul. This is a different thing, which is where I actually take my real contract and I hand it over to the court. Either way, the court is allowed to collect. Therefore, I can have a circumstance where there's a 10-year loan. Ditznan, as we learned in a Mishnah, if somebody loans with a mashkon, or he gives he gives his with a collateral, or he gives his contracts over to Beis Din, ein mishamtin mashmitin, then the Beis Din does not cancel the loan. There are those who learned the back and forth of this Gemara this way. In other words, that was one way of learning it. Now we're going to learn the same idea, but we start this way. Rav Yosef ben Shmuel, Hamalva es chaveru le'eser shanim, ein shvius misham taso. Somebody who loans money for 10 years, they started off with a statement, and loaned for 10 years, Shemitah does not cancel it. Even though Shemitah is going to cancel it, but it's not considered collectible today, and therefore Shemitah does not cancel it, as opposed to what we said at the beginning, where we started off with the discussion by saying Shemitah does cancel it. Now we're starting with the Shemitah does not cancel it. Amar Rav Kahana says, Af ananami tanina. We also have a Mishnah that supports that, as opposed to a Mishnah arguing with it. Now the Mishnah supports that statement. We're going to evaluate how much a person would pay for have $1,000 in his possession for 10 years as opposed to 30 days. Now, if you're going to tell me that Shemitah is going to cancel a loan that's 10 years, then our Mishnah would make no sense because the whole loan would get canceled by Shumile. So Amar Rava, Rava says, no, I will tell you why there is a circumstance Shemitah does cancel and Shemitah does not cancel, and he comes with his distinction. What are we talking about? This is only when Rabbi Yehuda says that Shemitah does not cancel. That's when you're loaning with collateral or you give your contracts over to Beis Din. Ditnan, as we learned in a Mishnah, that if you give your contracts over to Beis Din or you loan with a collateral, then Shemitah does not cancel. If I'm Rabbi Yehuda Marshmuel, Rabbi Yosef Marshmuel. Now, since we are going to be, we went back, what are we doing now? We're going to have different cases that are not related to each other, but we're discussing Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel with a question that Rav Kahana follows it up with. So we're going to have a few cases like that. That's where you're going to say, what is the connection with all these things in the Gemara we're learning? Not much. I'm Rav Yehuda Shmuel.
I was going to say, if Shemitah's 4 years out and you're paying it over 10 years, wouldn't he be liable for the first 4 years?
If you're paying it over time, right, you're going to be liable for whatever is due.
In that case,
but that's not the case. We said the entire loan is due after 10 years.
Right.
There's no payments, right? I'm just going to pay the entire thing at the end of 10 years.
Right.
Let's say somebody says, I'm going to loan you money on condition that Shemitah will not cancel this. So Shvius Mishametis, that doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want to say, but the Torah says differently than you, and it gets canceled. Lema Kosavar Shmuel, so that means that Shmuel is saying, Masna Mashikosav Batorahu, that what you're doing is you're making a condition against something that's written in the Torah. Masna Mashikosav Batorah Tano Botel. And he says that if you make a condition on something that's written in the Torah, two things. First of all, the condition doesn't stand because the Torah says the opposite of you. And second of all, the actual loan stands. You might think that since I made the loan on condition that something is true, that isn't true, that the actual transaction is canceled. Not true. The transaction goes through, but the detail of the dependent clause is canceled. V'ha itmar, but we have said as follows: what if somebody says, I'm going to sell this to you, but we're going to make a condition. There's a buyer protection in the Torah called onah, and it goes like this: if I sell you something and I overcharge you by more than a sixth, the sale is canceled. If I overcharge you and the value, the overchargement is exactly a sixth, then I have to pay you back the difference. If I overcharge you, but the overcharging is less than a sixth, then the sale is fine and it goes through, and we basically agree to that profit.
When you say overcharge, you mean with interest?
No, we're saying the actual, I have a candy bar I bought in the store for $1. This happens in yeshivas all the time. Somebody goes and buys a box of Coke for $4. They go to the yeshiva and they sell these 12 Cokes for $1 a piece, right? So that could be onah. Why? Because is that the value of the Coke?
Well,
And maybe or not. So because you can buy it in the machine for $1, maybe it's not. But I'm just saying, like, these are the issues. If I was there's a camp and they were charging bottles of water $24 for the case of bottle of water, I can go to Walmart and buy it for $6, and they're in camp charging $15 for it. And I said, well, how can you charge $15 just because you're in camp for the case? How can you charge $15? The price in Walmart for the same case is $6, right? And that's onah. Right, so that's an issue. Okay, so this is where the issue of onah comes up. You can't do that. So Rav says yesh lo alav onah. So if he says I'm making the sale, but I'm writing in the condition that there isn't onah, I'm sorry, the Torah says there is onah. This protection exists. Ushmuel Amar ein lo alav onah. Shmuel says there isn't onah. But one second. So Shmuel says that there's no onah, but Shmuel just said if you were going to make a condition on that which is against the Torah, then the condition is nullified, but the transaction stands. How do you explain Shmuel here's contradicting it? So we explained that already. Amar Rav Anon l'didi mefarshel minei de Shmuel. It was explained to me in the name of Shmuel. Amanas she'ein lecha alai onah. So then, if you make the statement, it depends on how you make the statement. If you make the statement on condition that you will not come back to me, I'll sell this to you, but you will not come back to me with a complaint that I charged you onah, ein lo alav onah. Then there's no onah. Then that's fine. Because you're not saying the Torah doesn't say there's onah. The Torah does say there's onah. I'm just saying that even if there is onah, you won't complain about it. You'll agree to give that money to me as a gift. That you can do. Al menashe ein bo onah. But if I make the condition that this sale, there's no onah, hare yesh onah, there is onah. Sorry, there is.
Onah means price fraud?
That's the price fraud, right? So hachanami, here too. Al menashe lo tishmeteni b'shvius. So if you make the condition on condition that this loan will not be canceled by Shemitah, so then ein shvius misham taso. Then okay, right? Because you're saying that I agree, Shemitah cancels. But we are going to agree that despite the fact that Shemitah is going to cancel, you're still going to pay me the money back anyway, because that's going to be the gracious way that you're going to handle this. So then that's fine. Al menash lo tishmeteni shvius, but if you make the condition that Shemitah will not cancel it, so Shvitas misham taso, then Shemitah does cancel. Okay, we're going to try a little bit. No, we'll stop here. Okay.
Beautiful.
Great case.
Yes.
Fantastic case.
What
What did you read on?
No, I did a chance. I done this Shemitah thing before because I came up with it.
You're here all for Yom
I
Tov?
thought Shemitah a lot.
Yeah.
So we look forward to having you
Unless he
come.
kicks me out.
So we look forward to having you all Yom Tov come join our class.
Actually, the